All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the monthly UC Water Webinar Series hosted by the Water Program team. My name is Ellen Bruno. I'm a CE specialist located at UC Berkeley, and I'm organizing this series with my colleague Safiq Khan at UC Merced. Today, we're delighted to have Dr. Isaiah Kisekka joining us as our speaker. He's an associate professor of agricultural water management and irrigation engineering at UC Davis. And he received his PhD from the University of Florida. He studies the movement of water, like through soil to the groundwater and through plants to the atmosphere with the goal of optimizing water use in agriculture. So today we're going to hear some about that with his talk, Sustainability of Irrigated Agriculture in the Central Valley of California. Before I turn it over to Isaiah, I just want to request that folks, as questions come up throughout the talk, to please type your questions into the chat. We will be recording this seminar, and it'll be available afterwards on the Water Program team's YouTube channel. And so because of the fact that we're recording, folks who are affiliated with the UC can speak up and be recorded in that way. But if you're not affiliated with UC, it'll be easier if you type your questions into the chat and Safiq can read them out at the end. And so, yeah, go ahead and take it away, Isaiah, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Helen and Safiq, for the opportunity to share some of my work. I'm going to be talking about sustainability of irrigated agriculture in the Central Valley of California. Most of you are very familiar with agriculture in California. California is the largest state in the country in terms of agriculture value. And some of the top agricultural commodities are dairy and almonds, and grapes, cattle, strawberries, pistachios, lettuce, walnuts, and tomatoes. And for this talk, I'm going to talk about alfalfa and almonds and what we're seeing in terms of water management and what are the technologies that the growers can use to adapt to the challenges, both climate and regulations. As you know, California has a very unique climate that allows us to grow a whole range of crops. We produce 99% of all almonds, 99% of all walnuts, 98% of all pistachios, and over 90% of processing tomatoes. So if you couple this Mediterranean climate with a very unique water delivery infrastructure, it allows us to grow crops that cannot be grown in many other parts of the US. So we have the Central Valley Water Project and the State Water Project, as well as groundwater and the Central Valley Aquifer systems. All these things combine to allow us to do a very productive agriculture. But there are challenges to irrigated agriculture in the Central Valley. And some of these, the drivers are climate change, regulations, markets, both domestic and international markets, as well as other economic factors. This is a map that I printed off of the NOAA website about 3 days ago, and it shows the drought status of the drought in the US. And you can see that most of the areas in the Central Valley are either under moderate drought, severe drought, or extreme drought. Now, since then, we've received some rainfall and snow, and hopefully the situation will improve, but we are still below normal. And, climate change affects us in California in a unique way because we swing between two extremes. We have multi-years of flooding, which you can see some here on the top in blue. And then you have multi-year of droughts. You can remember the recent one from 2012 to 2015. And so what this then does is it makes growers more reliant on groundwater. And because of that, there have been several problems. When growers have turned to groundwater as an insurance policy, then you get groundwater overdraft, you get subsidence, you get loss of aquifer storage, you get water quality deterioration, you get all this cascade of problems. And so the state had to do something. They enacted the Groundwater Act in 2014. And the Department of Water Resources sort of categorized these different groundwater basins in the Central Valley into different levels of overdraft. You can see here the Trolley Lake Basin, almost all the groundwater basins in this region of the Central Valley are classified as critically overdrafted, which means they really have to do something to get back to level of sustainability, as well as the San Joaquin Aquifer region. And the Sacramento Valley, I was looking at the most recent map from DWR, it actually beginning to show some overdraft in the Sacramento Valley as well. So the other extreme is flooding. So you have this, like between 2016 and 2017, you have this multi-year floods. How do you deal with them? The challenge is to figure out a way of tapping this excess water and using it to recharge the overdrafted aquifers. And so in the middle of all these are growers that have to become compliant with all the regulations that the different groundwater basins are proposed under their groundwater sustainability plans. So in addition to groundwater quantity, you have a groundwater quality issue. As you can imagine, if you overdraw your aquifers, you're going to have a concentration of contaminants, including nitrates. So this is a map that's showing nitrate levels in groundwater. And the Trolley Lake Basin here is exceeding the EPA limit of 10 milligrams per liter. And you can see similar areas here in the San Joaquin River watershed, as well as some parts here in the Sacramento Valley. And to address this, there's a regulation called the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And what this does is under this, what we call coalitions that help growers to remain compliant to these waste discharge requirements. So these coalitions develop best management practices that the growers can adapt to make sure that they don't discharge nitrates that will be in violation of whatever permits they have. So in addition to Sigma, now growers have to be compliant with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, whose goal is to protect groundwater quality from nitrate contamination. And recently there was another one called the Salt and Nitrate Management Plan, which covers the entire Central Valley, over 6 million acres. And again, the purpose of the Salt and Nitrate Management Program is to provide safe drinking water to affected communities. And the Regional Water Control Board has categorized these different basins into high priority, medium priority, and not prioritized. And again, you can see that most of the areas that have to immediately develop their nitrogen management plans are here in the Trolley Lake Basin and the San Joaquin River Basin, which are also overdrafted in terms of water quantity. So you have these two issues. You have a quantity issue and you have a quality issue. As a grower, you have to, within a groundwater basin, you have to contend with. The idea of the salt and nitrate management plan is to regulate not just irrigators, but other discharges like dairies, ranchers, food processors, and municipalities. And growers have an option. They can go in as an individual. They can submit their nitrogen management plan as an individual grower, or go in as a group in form of a management zone, which could involve irrigated agriculture, industry, urban areas. All these regulations had cost to a grower. And so the question is, how can the growers continue to remain sustainable under this environment? It is important that they produce in a way that they're aware of the sustainability, overall sustainability of the resource system, both the land and the water. But it is challenging to do that under a very constrained environment. I included this graph to show that although those regulations, for example, the Irrigated Lands Program and the Salt and Nitrate Program are targeted to nitrates, this is related to irrigation. If your irrigation is not well managed, or if your irrigation systems are not operating optimally, your nitrogen management will be poor as well. So you can see in this graph here, we have distribution uniformity on the x-axis and fertilizer distribution uniformity on the y-axis. And if your distribution uniformity is less than 4%, your nitrogen distribution uniformity is going to be poor as well. And this will lead into some areas getting optimum nitrogen and others getting less. And that increases the potential of nitrate leaching as well as reduced production. Another issue that is not explicitly regulated is the issue of soil salinization. Most of the other two regulations that I've talked about, they target contamination of groundwater. But we have a serious problem in the Central Valley related to soil salinity. You can see a map here of the Central Valley that shows salinity issues, especially again here in the Turale Lake Basin and the San Joaquin River watershed, especially on the west side of the valley. You have areas that have salinities exceeding 16 decisiemens per meter. That's a tough environment to grow crops. There have been studies that have estimated that more than 1.5 million acres are already salinity impaired. And this problem is going to cost the state over $1.5 billion by 2030, in addition to jobs. Here you can see these salt rings on the circumference of a drip. This is an almond orchard that is being irrigated with a double-line drip. Salinity, in some ways, is a much more serious problem to irrigated agriculture than nitrates, because it can completely shut down irrigated agriculture. So how do growers adapt to these challenges? Well, there's no single silver bullet that growers can do. However, there are different things that they can do together to help them cope with these different challenges. And one of those is adopting smart irrigation management practices. So in the next couple of slides, I'll be sharing some of the work we have done in terms of evaluating some of these management practices and technologies. I'd like to start by a study we just recently concluded, looking at site-specific irrigation management for young almond orchards. We did this study in collaboration with the Almond Board. The Almond Board has a goal. One of their sustainability goals is to reduce the amount of water used to irrigate to produce a pound of almonds by 20%. And growers are already efficient. A lot of them have moved to very efficient micro irrigation systems. So what we are doing now is trying to squeeze the last drop of efficiency that we can get from these orchard systems. And one way to do that is to understand how much each crop water use at different ages of the crop. This graph shows the number of non-bearing acres as well as bearing acres. And you can see quite a substantial increase in non-bearing acres over the last 20 years. And the question was, how should growers be irrigating these young almond orchards? Should they be using crop coefficients, for example, that were developed for these mature orchards? And if they do, how should they adjust them? And one of the factors that affect or influence how much water a tree uses is the size of canopy. So you can see a first leaf orchard or a first year orchard has a significantly different size of canopy to a second leaf or second year orchard. And we were fortunate to find a grower that had planted 3 orchards within the same location. He had one that he had planted in 2016, 2017, and 2018 near Conning. And he allowed us to work on his ranch, and we installed these ET flux towers, which are based on residual the energy balance. So what we did was to measure net radiation, sensible heat flux, and the soil heat flux, and we estimated ET from this latent heat flux. We put each of these, a station like this in each of these 3 orchards. And we were able to show that the amount of water the trees used increased with age as expected. You can see the actual crop coefficient here increasing up to about 4 to 5 years, and then it levels off. And at that point, the crop water use is equivalent or very close to a mature orchard. But this is not a very good way to represent tree water use, because a 4-year-old orchard in the Sacramento Valley may look very different from a 4-year-old orchard in the San Joaquin Valley. And so we express this crop coefficient in terms of percentage of photosynthetically active radiation that is intercepted by the tree canopy. And again, we found that if you reach about 50 to 60%, the crop water use of a young almond orchard approximates a mature orchard. At 50% per, you're looking at about 98% ET of a mature orchard. Another study which we have recently concluded as well in collaboration with the Almond Board was site-specific irrigation by variety. As you know, almonds in California are planted within a given orchard. You have different varieties in order to achieve effective pollination. Now there are orchards that, where you have only one variety, independent varieties, but for the most part, a lot of orchards have this design where you have different varieties. And the idea was that these trees their growth cycles are different. So if we irrigated these, different trees, differently, maybe we may gain some water use efficiencies there. We did this study at the Nichols Soil Lab, which is near Albuquerque. And you can see we had a butte variety here on the eastern edge. Then we had a non-parallel variety, and then we had the Aldrich is the one showing off as white here. And we installed irrigation systems that allowed us to control the amount of water that went on each different variety. These red pin points are nodes that allow us to wirelessly control this irrigation system from Davis instead of having to drive to the site. This is the experimental design. It was a split block experimental design, randomized block design. And for example, here for the butte variety, we had different levels of regulated deficit irrigation. Okay. And this was replicated 5 times. I will use the next slide to explain what each treatment is. For example, in treatment 1 and 2, we applied 100% ET until we reached the whole split of the non-parallel, and then all the other varieties within the block were deficit irrigated to 75%. And then after harvest, we went back to 100%. But in variety-specific irrigation scheduling, we decreased irrigation, or we went to deficit irrigation when each tree reached each variety-specific whole split. That's why you see we have 3 points here where we're dropping off from full irrigation to deficit irrigation. And then we repeated this, but instead of reducing to 75% at whole split, we reduced it to 50%. And what we found was that there was no significant difference irrigating by variety. Okay. That's why you see these numbers here, these letters here are the same for all these 4 different irrigation management strategies. But we saw significant differences in yield for the different varieties, but this was already known, so it was not new. What we were hoping to investigate and find a significant response was if irrigating by variety was better than irrigating based on non-peril, which is sort of the standard practice that a lot of growers go by. We repeated the study in 2020, and we found the same results. And so our conclusion was irrigating based on non-peril is sufficient under the conditions in which we did this experiment, and it's less complicated than irrigating by variety, which would require retrofitting the irrigation system. However, there could be some benefits in terms of water use because we cut back up to 50% at whole split, but we did not see a significant difference compared to, say, 75%, cutting back at 75%. So that could be a potential benefit. The other study that I would like to talk about is site-specific irrigation management based on specifically zone management. And the idea here is that, we have had this significant increase in nut production in California, and this has resulted into this production extending on marginal soils. And these marginal soils tend to be more variable in terms of their water holding capacity, in terms of their infiltration rate. And what you see in this picture is a typical example. If you look carefully, you'll see that the canopy here in this Google image is, you see some darker green and some light greens. And on the right side is a soil map made using the EM38 or Variance. What we do, we drive this instrument, which measures either conductivity or resistivity in the soil. And resistivity in the soil is mostly driven by either soil moisture content, salinity, or clay content. And in an area like this where there was no history of salinity, what drove this variation was differences in water holding capacity or soil texture, in particular clay content. And if you look carefully here, you'll see that the dark green matches areas where we have the heavy soils, and the light matches the areas where we have light soils. So the orange or red here, areas that have these deep, nice heavy soils. The green are sort of transitional soils where you have the heavy soil on top and the light soil on the bottom, and the blue are light soils. So to understand the impact of soil variability and to help the grower manage this, there are two ways you could do this. You could use variable rate irrigation, where you install an irrigation system that follows the shape of the soil variability, but that is expensive. Or you irrigate the entire block the same way, which is sort of the conventional approach. The middle ground is using what we call zone irrigation, whereby you make a zone which will have a dominant soil type, but also other soil types. And we wanted to see if by doing this, we would reduce the variability in yield across these blocks. So we had 14 monitoring locations. At each location, we monitored soil moisture, tree water status, applied irrigation, as well as stem water potential. And again, if you look, these are the different soils, and the heavy soils, you have a sort of a deep, nice clay soil. And where you have layered soil, you have a heavy soil on top and the coarse soil on the bottom, and the light soils tend to be very gravelly with low water holding capacity. The most challenging one to work with are these layered soils because they tend to have low infiltration rates. I apologize, this is a very busy slide, but what I wanted to point your attention to is this variability in yield. You're going from 4,000 pounds per acre all the way to 2,600 pounds per acre. The goal of zone irrigation management is to help the grower improve production in these low producing areas of the orchard. And by improving production, there is a possibility that they would improve resource use efficiency in terms of water or nutrients or labor or other resources. Now, this variability could be driven by differences in variety here, because we have Butte, we have Monterey, we have nonpareil variety. But if you sort this out and just look at one variety, for example, if we just look at nonpareil, we still see this variability in yield. And this could be because, for example, a zone which had heavy soil was being irrigated as a light soil. And so it experienced stress. And maybe there are opportunities for the grower to retrofit the irrigation system to make sure that these heavy soils are irrigated as heavy soils. Another very enlightening thing that we found was that, for orchards in general, the technology to generate yield maps is still in its infancy. And the only way to validate really, or to evaluate if we are improving production, especially, or if we are reducing the spatial variability in production, is we need a yield map, but currently we don't. But we were able to discover that there is a strong relationship between yield and cumulative biomass. And this biomass is estimated from remote sensing. You can estimate biomass from remote sensing using refractance and crop-specific radiation use efficiency. These are all equations that were proposed by Monteith in the 80s. But now with better satellite resolutions, we can then use them to estimate biomass. And the first figure on my right is cumulative biomass from Landsat and Sentinel satellites correlated with the grower average yields. The grower averaged the entire block. And on the right is the same correlation of cumulative biomass with our plot yields. We were harvesting much smaller plots around our measurement locations compared to averaging the entire block. And you see the correlation is strong in either case. This means that there is an opportunity to evaluate spatial variability using these satellite images translated into biomass. There's actually a commercial company now called Irrigation that provides satellite ET, but in addition to that, they also provide cumulative biomass. So this legend shows the biomass over this orchard. This was actually walnuts, and this is almonds here. So we can use this as a proxy to measure how well the variability is reducing over time. We also wanted to understand the correlation between yield and stem water potential. This is stem water potential bars below baseline. As expected, the more stress the trees experienced, there was a reduction in yield. And stem water potential explained about 26% of the variation in yield, while applied irrigation explained about 41% of the observed variation in yield. So what this means is it is important to monitor stem water potential as a feedback of how trees are responding to your irrigation management. This particular grower did a good job in terms of irrigation management because the ideal range you want to be for almonds is between -2 to -8, which translates into about 6 to 8 bars if you're taking direct measurements. Ideally, you want to be within this blue range. Here, the grower fell a little bit behind in terms of meeting crop water needs. And you can see the variability was wide between all these different soil types, okay? Between layered soil and light soils. And then we had a deliberate dry down here that happens before harvest. So overall, this was a good orchard to monitor. I would like now to move into some of the technologies we have been looking at. Some of them are still not ready for commercial adoption, but they are very promising. And the two that I would like to focus on is cosmic ray neutron probes, which are shown here. I will explain in a minute how they work. And then automated monitoring of soil of stormwater potential. And both of them try to go after challenges that growers have experienced in monitoring, especially in tree crops. If you use in situ sensors, which you have to put at a particular point in the field, the data is hard to interpret because these tree crops have very large rooting systems. So these cosmic ray neutron probes, they measure soil moisture over a wider area. And when it comes to stormwater potential, the standard has been to use a pressure bomb. You have to go at a particular time of day, which is solar noon, and you have to bag a leaf and then put it in a pressure bomb to a symmetry water status. But with improvements in sensing technology, this has also been largely overcome, but the technology still needs to be validated under a wide range of conditions. And that's what we have been trying to do. This is one of my grad students, Kelly, looking at comparing performance of these osmometers. And what they are is basically a small sensor that you put into the tree trunk, and it has a membrane that allows a fluid to go across it. When the tree is dry, the fluid moves from the sensor to the tree. And when the tree is wet, the fluid goes the other way, and you get a voltage signal that can be interpreted in terms of stormwater potential. And what you see here is our measurements from different trees. The orange ones are the stormwater potential, periodic measurements of stormwater potential, and the blue line are the measurements from these stormwater potential sensors or osmometers. Overall, you see that the tree, once you calibrate these sensors, they perform quite well in terms of giving you a meaningful stormwater potential number. And if you look at the colorations, again, you see very good coloration between the pressure bomb as well as the stormwater potential sensor in most of the trees. Now, we did this in almonds and walnuts. We had better performance in almonds than we had in walnuts. In walnuts, we had what was called a wound rejection, where the tree, over time, produced a fluid that separated the sensor from the tree. So the contact between the sensor and the tree xylem wasn't very good. So the performance of these sensors is not the same across different tree species. But in talking to the growers, one of the growers told me, okay, you're giving me all this data, that is good, but you're giving me data of something that has already happened. Is there a way to give me data of something that is going to happen? I want to know what stormwater potential is going to be in the next week, so I can plan my water deliveries, or I can plan my labor, the people that are going to go in the different blocks to turn the valves on and off. And so with this challenge, and this is really an advantage of working with cooperative extension farm advisors that really, make that connection with the growers more seamless. The grower was able to give us feedback that really helped us, formulate a new research question of, can we predict stormwater potential ahead of time? Now, we have incomplete understanding of the physiology of trees, so we couldn't find a very clean mechanistic way of predicting stormwater potential ahead of time. So we turned to machine learning, and some people look at them as black boxes, but they have the advantage of predictive power. And we say, if we create a simple neural network, we started with a simple neural network or a deep learning neural network, and we provide it all the inputs we think have an influence on stem water potential? Can we be able to forecast what that stem water potential is going to be? So if you provided soil moisture content, vapor pressure deficit, solar radiation, the age of the tree, the variety of the tree, the accumulated growing degree days, can we predict stem water potential? That's what we try to do. And our preliminary results are promising. Here I show the training, the R from the training is about 87, the validation is about 88, the test is about 85, and if you combine all the data together, you have about 87. So we are still building this framework. The disadvantage is that you have to train this model for each site. But once you train it, it's very powerful. You can be able to make future predictions of stem water potential. And this is very useful for management. Now I'd like to talk about cosmic ray neutron probes. This is the stem water potential sensors that I previously talked about are already commercially available. The cosmic ray, they're commercially available, but mostly for different applications. They actually, the Mars rover also had a cosmic ray sensor to look for water on Mars. They also use them for snow monitoring and other applications, but we think they can have value in agriculture for soil water monitoring. And basically the way these cosmic ray sensors work is you have these cosmic rays coming from outer space, and when they come into the atmosphere, they find other particles, and when they collide, they produce a lot of these neutrons. And when these neutrons at the near soil surface, when they collide with other particles in the soil, they produce very fast moving neutrons. Now, these very fast moving neutrons are slowed down if they hit an hydrogen atom. And so in the near soil surface, the material that has the highest amount of hydrogen atoms is water. And that's why we're able to develop an inverse relationship between the intensity of these slowed down neutrons. These are the black dots here, they are slowed down neutrons, and soil water content. So if you have a dry soil without much hydrogen, you will have a lot of these fast-moving neutrons and slow-moving neutrons escaping above the soil surface. If you have a wet soil, a saturated soil, or a wet soil, you will have what is called retardation, and you'll have fewer neutrons here. And then you have this detector here. This is how the cosmic ray looks. We have a neutron detector here in this vertical white box, and then this here with data logging devices. Now, why is this important? This neutron probe, the idea is to replace a traditional, what we call an in situ neutron probe, which has been used for decades. It's actually the most accurate soil moisture sensor, but it has limitations. It has an active neutron source, and it is also regulated. So a lot of growers have not used it, with an exception of the grape industry. It's mostly used in research. This is also a neutron probe, but it's a passive neutron probe. So we think it can be easily adopted. It doesn't have regulations, and it can give you an average soil moisture over a wider area, about 15 acres. And so we went and installed it on a ranch near Corning again, working with Alan Fulton. And we also installed the traditional neutron probe access tubes. So we wanted to compare the neutron probe readings we get from this cosmic ray sensor from what we were getting from this traditional in situ neutron probe. By the way, we don't have any sensor that measures soil water directly. All of them measure something else, a surrogate property that they correlate with soil moisture content. But the neutron probe by far is the most accurate. And all of them, because of that, need some type of calibration. So in order to calibrate this cosmic ray sensor, we went and collected soil moisture samples at different distances from the neutron probe point here, and at different depths, at 15, 20, 30, and 40 centimeters. And we did these varying distances from 25, 75, and 150 centimeters. Brought the samples back to the lab and oven dried them and went through the procedure to estimate volumetric water content. What we found was that the Neutron probe readings, which are the dots here, the black being 75 centimeters, the red being 45 centimeters, and the yellow being 25 centimeters, they actually correlated well with a cosmic ray neutron probe, okay? Especially the 45 and 75 centimeter readings. We also had Irrigation, the company I showed earlier, also provide soil moisture for their near surface, which agreed better with neutron probe at the 20 centimeter depth. Neutron probe data at shallow depth is not very accurate because you have neutrons escaping the soil surface. Very similar concept to what I showed earlier, where you have these cosmic ray neutrons escaping. Even for the traditional neutron probe, you have neutrons escaping. The other insight we found was that at harvest, we were showing very high soil moisture, which is not the case because we know the orchard is being dried down. But then you have, the nuts are being shaken on the ground, and you have them sitting on the orchard floor and interfering with the neutrons that are escaping above the ground. And since it is an inverse relationship, the less the neutrons you have above the ground, the more soil moisture. The sensor thought this reduction in neutron intensity was due to soil moisture content, but it was actually, we think, due to these nuts that were on the orchard floor. If you break it down and look at the data by depth, we actually see much better agreement at 45 and 75 centimeters, which is really the depth at which you have most of the active water and nutrient uptake in the soil. Then I would like also to talk very briefly about validation of remote sensing best ET. There's a lot of interest in site-specific ET estimation. A lot of people are moving away from the crop coefficient approach to this remote sensing based approach, but there are still questions about the accuracy and validity. And so we worked with both the Almond Board and the Department of Water Resources to try and validate how accurate these remote sensing methods are. And we're actually pleased that this model that we worked with, the surface energy balance model, performed well compared to an ecovariance station. We installed a LICO ecovariance station in an almond orchard, and you can see very good agreement. The blue is the flux tower, and the brown is the remote sensing. And you can see that we have an R squared of about 80 and the root mean square error of just under 1 millimeter, which is pretty decent. Finally, I'd like to talk about the work we are doing in field crops, looking at smart irrigation management in alfalfa. And as you may be aware that we've had significant changes in cropping patterns. We've had increases in almonds, and we've had almost a similar decrease in alfalfa. And this has an impact on consumptive use within watersheds and groundwater basins. These two figures show changes in land use between 2017 and 2018 in the San Joaquin watershed. The red is the almonds and the blue is the alfalfa. You can see in this period of about 13 years, there's a lot less blue here and there's a lot more red. But as I showed in my first graph, the number one commodity in or agricultural produce in California is not almond in terms of value, but it's dairy and dairy products. So we still need alfalfa to feed these dairies. How do we do it with limited water supplies? We started to look at different technologies, and one of those is very high precision mechanized irrigation systems. And we had this low elevation spray application where you have these sprinklers very close to the ground or very close to the crop, which reduces wind drift. It actually is quite efficient. And also looking at mobile drip irrigation, where we replaced the sprinklers with a drip irrigation to try to put the water on the ground. Then we looked at differences in yield, as well as technologies that could be used to monitor soil moisture in alfalfa. You can see here that the LISA, or low elevation spray application, actually performed well across these different deficit irrigation strategies. This first box here is full ET. The red is the LISA and the blue is the drip. And the next box here is 60% ET and with a sudden cutoff in the summer. And the third box here is 60% ET throughout the season. And the last one is 40% ET. As expected, when you cut water, you're going to cut yield. So the 40% here produce less yield compared to a fully irrigated crop. But we also found that the LISA actually performed much better than the mobile drip, with an exception of when you have a sudden cutoff in the summer, then the drip performed much better than the LISA. And all these have to do with root zone soil water storage. One issue in alfalfa is soil water monitoring, because you have to manage the soil moisture before cuttings. You don't want the field too wet. And that's where these pressurized precision systems may be better than flood for in-season management, because they can allow you to irrigate very close to a cutting and without keeping the field so wet. But you need a way to monitor soil moisture. Now, in research, we are using a Neutron probe, but as I said earlier, this is not very convenient for growers. The other option is to use this EM38 or electrical magnetic induction instrument that one of Daniel Putnam's students here is calibrating, or use these TDR sensors. We have not found good luck in alfalfa with these TDR sensors because rodents eat the cables and data can be variable from one location to another. But we have found some interesting results with this indirect measurement with EM38. This is during the season. These are different plots, and you can see that this EM38 instrument, which measures conductivity in the soil, which is driven by soil water content, salinity, and clay content. In this study was done at Davis. We don't have any salinity, so this is primarily driven by soil water content. This EM38 sensor was able to give us relative differences in soil water over the experimental plot. Now, this is useful to a grower because they can put this sensor behind any of their tractors and drive it in the field. You're not going to get an absolute soil moisture value unless you calibrate it, but you can get relative differences of soil moisture, which part of the field is wet, which part of the field is dry. And because of a wet winter, a very dry winter, we did some winter recharge where we applied flood irrigation to these plots that were in 2020 deficit irrigated, and again did a scan with this instrument, and you can see that it could clearly show us where it was wet and where it was very dry. In summary, I have talked about irrigated agriculture in the Central Valley and the many challenges it faces, and the opportunities for advanced technologies to help growers remain productive while being compliant with these regulations. But growers are not going to adopt these technologies unless these technologies can demonstrate a return on investment or they are mandated to do so. So there is still a gap on all this technology and demonstrating that it can actually help growers before they can adopt it. And for long-term sustainability, there should be partnerships between the growers, regulators, private sector, environmental group, and other stakeholders. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants clean water, wants to have food nice, nutritious food, but the way we get there would require a lot of collaboration and partnership. So I'd like to stop here. I'd like to acknowledge all my collaborators and hopefully leave a few minutes for questions or discussions. Thank you. I give it back, Helen and Safik.
Yes, thank you, Isaiah. So I'll just start with going through a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. The first two are related from Steve and Sonia. I'm going to try to ask them together, relating to cover crops in orchard management. So there's interest in adding cover crops to orchard management that requires additional water. How does that fit with the Almond Board's irrigation reduction objectives? And then, following up on that, Sonia says, I second Steve's question. I wonder whether at some point it's going to come down to choosing between creating healthy, diverse agro ecosystems versus going all out to reduce inputs per yield of single crops and farms staying economically viable. Are these two goals at odds in challenging environments like the San Joaquin Valley, or can we make them complementary?
That's a very good question. I think it's going to vary in different ecosystems, but the Almond Board is actually, as far as I can tell, is interested in cover crops, because cover crops also have an interaction with soil water dynamics or soil water hydrology. If you can improve infiltration, improve soil structure, then you can, infiltrate more water, you can store more water, you can give the trees a much bigger volume of soil to explore than, if you're having a conventional system. And they can, in the sense, make your system more resilient to climate change. However, in some systems which are extremely water limited, you have to get a balance between crop water use from a cover crop and crop water use from your primary crop. But I still think even in such systems, just improving the soil hydraulic properties still has a benefit. And in fact, in terms of irrigation, we are now encouraging growers to adopt dual purpose irrigation systems, or irrigation systems that are not primarily to irrigate your crop, but also are going to irrigate your cover crop. For example, if you're using a double line drip, you can couple that with a few sprinklers that are going to push water closer in the rows to help germinate your cover crop, because we think that in the long term makes your system more resilient.
Great. So the next question, what depth of soil can be measured with cosmic ray technology?
So from the data that I showed, we seem to see better correlation between 45 centimeters to 75 centimeters, or about 18 inches to about 30 inches.
Can you please share more information regarding access to data from IrriWatch for grad students?
Yeah, I can provide a URL that it's a private company, so the farmers have to provide a fee. But I know, for example, the Madeira Irrigation District and the groundwater basin in the Madeira area, they have bought the service for their growers for the entire groundwater basin to, again, address the issue of water demand. So if you're working in that area, then you may be able to get it free. But I will try to put a chart, the URL in the chat. Sorry, go on, Helen.
Oh, and then it looks like there was just a follow-up comment related to the cover crop discussion. Someone mentioned also cover crops help in pollination, and then compost applications might achieve some of the same improvements as cover crops. So those are comments. Obviously, welcome to respond to those, Isaiah, if you'd like. I also want to ask everyone if there are any additional questions. I think those are the only other ones that came up in the chat during the talk, but if folks have any additional questions, we still have just a couple more minutes. We could squeeze a few more in.
Yeah, Isaiah, this is Safiq. A quick question on balancing the objective between water saving and managing groundwater, right? Sometimes they don't go hand in hand. So how do we increase recharge while making plants more efficient when it comes to water use?
You know,
Just wondering if you have thought about that issue.
yeah, we know we need both. We need to replenish our groundwater supplies, and we need food. We need good, nutritious food to sustain, you know, both demand and our local economies. I think this problem can be addressed on both the supply side and as well as the demand side. On the supply side, you can try to do things like managed aquifer recharge. On the supply side, you can try to do things like fallowing land, which I understand could have an economic implications. But you know, looking at some of the groundwater basin sustainability plans, some agencies are trying to address both issues that way, in looking at increasing supply, but also reducing demand through following alternative water supplies. In fact, in some areas in the Turale Lake Basin, for example, they are using oil field produced water or the blackish groundwater or any other alternative water supply to supplement groundwater.
And then one final quick question in the chat has come up. Did you measure crop K for different varieties? Were there any differences?
The crop coefficient we measured was over the entire, because the footprint of this ET flux tower was, you know, over the entire orchard that had both Monterey and non-Peru varieties. We're not able to separate the KC out by variety just because of the technique we were using to measure the ET fluxes.
Okay, great. Well, that brings us till 4. It was perfect timing, everybody. So thank you so much, Isaiah, for the great talk, and everyone please join me in thanking Isaiah. Thank you all for joining us today. And
It was a great talk. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.